There's a
He turned away every beautiful widow in Red Hollow, but one plain, overlooked girl with calloused hands and a broken grandfather saw something in his boots that could destroy powerful men. Now the whole town wants her gone, and the most feared cowboy on the frontier has to decide, protect his reputation or bet everything on a girl nobody believed in. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the end, because what happens in that storm will change everything you think you know about loyalty. The morning Cade Mercer rode back into Red Hollow with blood on his sleeve and a tear clean through the sole of his left boot. He was in no mood for conversation. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten anything since a strip of dried jerky somewhere around midnight, crouched behind a boulder while 3 of his cattle disappeared into the darkness, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it alone. The storm had swallowed the tracks. The cold had gotten into his hands the way it always did in late October. Not just chilly, but mean. The kind of cold that found the old knife wound on his right palm and squeezed. He rode straight down Main Street without looking left or right, which was exactly how he always rode through town. People noticed anyway. They always noticed Cade Mercer. "There he is," a woman murmured somewhere to his left. He didn't turn his head. Red Hollow had about 400 people if you counted the homesteads stretching out past the church and the livery. It was not a beautiful town. The buildings were functional at best. Weathered wood, tin roofs that rattled in the wind, porches that sagged in the middle where the snow sat too long each winter. The main street was unpaved and turned into a muddy disaster every time it rained, which it did often enough that the town had given up pretending it would ever be otherwise. 2 saloons faced each other across that street, like old enemies who'd gotten tired of fighting but hadn't quite learned to look away. Cade had lived here for 11 years. He'd watched this town bury good men and celebrate bad ones. He'd watched drought kill 3 families in the same summer and seen the survivors pick up and keep going like there was nothing else to do, because there wasn't. He'd built his ranch, the 3-Notch, from 40 head of cattle and a broken-down barn that had nearly fallen on him twice during the first winter. He was not a beloved figure in Red Hollow. He was a respected one, which was a different thing entirely. People respected Cade the way they respected a bad winter, not with warmth, but with a kind of careful attention. You kept track of where he was. You gave him room. You didn't cross him if you could help it. And if you needed something done that required a man who wouldn't flinch or fold, you came to him and you paid fairly, and you didn't waste his time. He was 34 years old and he looked older. The sun and wind had done that, and the years before Red Hollow had done the rest. He had a lean, angular face that some women had found striking when they'd first seen it across a room, though most of them changed their minds once they got close enough to see how little warmth lived in those gray-green eyes. Not cruelty. Cade wasn't cruel, just distance. Like looking out a window at something far away. He had turned down, by the town's careful count, which was maintained primarily by Dorothea Hale and her circle of friends who had nothing better to do, 7 widows in the past 4 years. 7. This was considered extraordinary. The widows of Red Hollow were not unattractive women. Martha Price had inherited her husband's mercantile and was considered quite handsome. Helen DuPont had red hair and a laugh that carried 3 blocks. Sylvia Crane wore dresses that had been made in Kansas City and didn't let anyone forget it. All 7 had tried in various ways to attach themselves to Cade Mercer's life, his ranch, his money, or some combination of the 3. All 7 had been politely, firmly, and thoroughly refused. The town had theories. He was grieving some woman from his past. He preferred men. He'd made a vow. He was too proud. He was too broken. He was waiting for someone specific. Cade knew about the theories. He didn't care about them. He'd stopped explaining himself to people around the same time he'd stopped trusting them, which had happened 11 years ago in a single afternoon that he didn't think about if he could help it. He tied his horse at the post outside Grady's feed and stepped down carefully, favoring his left foot out of habit, even though the boot was the problem, not anything underneath it. The tear had happened during the cattle run. A piece of barbed wire that some fool had left coiled in the grass had caught the heel as he'd vaulted a fence in the dark. The sole had peeled back a good 3 inches. He'd ridden the last 2 hours with cold mud seeping in through the gap with every step, which had put him in a foul mood on top of the already foul mood. He needed the boots fixed. He stood on the porch of the feed store and thought about that for a moment. The only cobbler in Red Hollow had been Walt Greer, who'd run a small shop on the east end of Main Street for 15 years. Walt had died in August, fell off a ladder cleaning his gutters, which was the kind of death that felt wrong. Not dramatic enough for a man who'd survived Indian raids and 2 droughts and a cholera outbreak. Since Walt's death, the shop had been taken over by his granddaughter. Cade had heard things about this arrangement. Specifically, he'd heard Dorothea Hale and her friends discussing it at a volume that suggested they didn't care who overheard, which meant they wanted everyone to overhear. She's not a real cobbler. Walt never finished training her. Running that shop into the ground is what she's doing. Poor thing. Someone should tell her to find something more suitable. He hadn't paid much attention. He had bigger concerns than who was fixing boots on the east end of town. But now his boot had a 3-inch tear, and the closest real cobbler was 40 miles away in Buckton, and he wasn't riding 40 miles in this condition. He stood there for another moment. Then he turned east. The shop was easy to miss. It sat between the barber and a storage building that had been empty for 2 years, its sign so faded that you had to already know what it said to read it. Greer's Boot and Leather Repair. The paint was peeling on the G. The window had a crack in the lower right corner that had been patched with a strip of rawhide from the inside. An odd solution, but effective enough to keep the wind out. There was a hand-lettered addition at the bottom of the sign, newer than the rest, the letters slightly uneven but carefully done. Under new management, E. Boone. Cade pushed the door open. The bell above it gave a small, tired jingle. The shop was narrow and smelled strongly of leather, oil, and something else, something that turned out to be a small pot of soup sitting on an iron plate near the back, kept warm by a low fire. It was a cluttered space, but not chaotic. Tools hung from pegs on the wall in a specific order that suggested they were actually used and not just displayed. Boots and shoes in various states of repair sat on a long workbench running the length of the right wall. The shelves above held waxes and oils and thick spools of thread in brown and black, and a dark red that Cade didn't see much use for in frontier cobblery. Behind the workbench, on a low stool, sat the girl. He'd seen her before, in the vague way you saw everyone in a town of 400. She was Walt's granddaughter. He'd known that much, but he realized now that he'd never actually looked at her directly. Elira Boone was 22, though she could have passed for younger in some lights and older in others, depending on how tired she was. She was a large girl, not just tall but broad, with the kind of solid, substantial build that her aunts had apparently spent years commenting on, based on a few overheard conversations Cade had never paid attention to. She had brown hair pulled back in a practical knot that was listing slightly to the left, as though it had started the morning neat and then given up. Her hands, resting on a boot she'd been stitching when he walked in, were rough and stained with oil. Working hands, not soft ones. She looked up. Her eyes were dark brown, clear and level, and they assessed him with a directness that he found, unexpectedly, almost startling. Not nervous, not immediately impressed, just looking at him, the way you'd look at a piece of work someone had brought you to evaluate. "You're Mercer," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," he said. She looked at his feet, specifically at his left boot, and the mud caking the gap where the sole had come away. "Barbed wire?" she said. "Barbed wire." She set down the boot she'd been working on and held out her hand. "Left one." He sat on the low bench near the door that was clearly there for this purpose, pulled off the boot with some effort, the mud had made it stiffer than usual, and handed it to her. She turned it over, examined the damage, pressed the sole back into place, and watched how it held. She ran a thumb along the tear, checking the leather on either side of it. She was thorough and quiet about it, and she didn't look up at him while she worked, which he found he didn't mind. Most people talked too much when they were around him, filling the silence with chatter, with questions designed to seem casual but weren't, with little attempts at connection that felt more like tests. He'd gotten practiced at ending those conversations without being openly rude, though he knew he didn't always succeed at the not rude part. This girl said nothing. After a minute, she set the boot on the bench and looked at him. "The sole's the main problem, but it's not the only one," she said. "See here." She held it up and pointed to a section of stitching near the toe, on the inner welt. "This has been wearing through for a while. Another few hard rides and it comes apart." He looked at where she was pointing. She was right. Also, the left heel is built up unevenly, she continued, matter-of-factly. That's probably why you took the fence the way you did. Off balance on that side. She paused. That's a guess. Might be wrong. You're not wrong, he said. She nodded, neither pleased nor surprised. I can fix all of it. 3 days. I need them sooner. 2 days then, but not sooner than that. I'm not rushing a welt stitch on work boots. You'll lose the soul again the next time you run cattle, and you'll be back here annoyed. There was no apology in it, but no sharpness either. She said it the way you'd state a fact about weather. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, 2 days. I'll need the other boot too, she said, for the heel comparison. He pulled off his right boot and handed it over. $3 for the full repair, she said, setting both boots on her workbench and pulling a small ledger toward her. He reached into his coat, pulled out $4, and set them on the corner of her workbench. She looked at the $4. She looked at him. I said 3, she said. I heard you. I'm not a charity. I know that. He picked up the extra dollar and put it back in his pocket, because she'd said it in a tone that made him believe she actually meant it, and he found he didn't want to have an argument about it. 3. She wrote his name in the ledger about, careful, even letters, and didn't look up again. He stood, nodded once, and left. Outside, he realized he was standing on the boardwalk in his socks. He looked down at them. Brown wool, worn thin at the heel. He'd walked from the door to the hitching post before he'd processed the situation. He went back for his spare pair of boots from his saddlebag. He always kept a backup pair because the frontier was no place for a man with only one set of footwear, and pulled them on and rode home. He thought about the girl once during the ride back briefly, the way she'd looked at the boots and not at him. The lack of performance in her manner. No attempt to impress, no nervousness, no obvious strategy. Then he thought about his missing cattle and the tracks that had been swallowed by the storm, and the thought of Aliraboon slipped away like smoke. He'd built 3 Notch Ranch on a piece of land that most people had considered marginal when he'd bought it. Rocky in the north section, prone to flooding in the southeast corner in spring, with a creek that ran good and clean, but had a tendency to shift its banks in wet years. He'd bought it cheap because of all that. He'd then spent the better part of 3 years doing the unglamorous work of making marginal land productive, clearing rock, building drainage channels, moving the barn twice to find ground that held. It had paid off. 3 Notch ran 460 head of cattle now, more than any other operation within a 30-mile radius. He had 2 full-time ranch hands, brothers named Pete and Denny Marsh, and he hired seasonal help during Roundup. He'd built the main house himself, with help from Pete and Denny, over one long summer. It wasn't grand, but it was solid, and it was his in a way that felt different from anything else he owned. That feeling, the specific weight of the ranch beneath his feet, was more or less the only thing he would call precious to him, which was why the disappearing cattle were keeping him awake. He'd lost 9 head in the past 6 weeks. Not to predators. He knew what predator kills looked like, and this wasn't it. The animals simply vanished overnight from sections of the property that should have been secure. The fence lines were intact every morning. The dogs hadn't raised an alarm. It was clean, professional, and infuriating. Pete thought he was miscounting. You're not miscounting, Denny had said, which was the more useful input. Cade had ridden every inch of the fence lines twice. He'd found nothing obviously wrong. He'd ridden out with the cattle at night twice, staying through till dawn, and lost no animals on either of those nights, which meant whoever was doing this was patient, or watching, or both. He'd considered going to the sheriff, but the sheriff of Red Hollow was a man named Olin Burke, who was not corrupt exactly, but was thoroughly useless, which amounted to about the same thing when you needed help. So he was handling it himself. He rode back to 3 Notch thinking about fence lines and cattle counts and the specific mathematics of loss, and he didn't sleep well that night, and in the morning there were 3 more head gone from the north pasture. Dorothea Hale's sitting room was, in the opinion of most women in Red Hollow who had been invited into it, the nicest room in town. It had real curtains, imported from somewhere back east, in a dark green that made the room feel like a drawing from a magazine. It had a settee with actual upholstery on it. It had a cabinet with glass doors that held china, and the china was used sometimes, not just displayed, which Dorothea considered important because it was the difference between a real fine room and a pretend one. On Tuesday morning, 4 days after Cade Mercer's visit to Elira Boone's shop, 6 women were gathered in that room, and the topic of conversation had, as it so frequently did, turned to the cowboy who wouldn't be caught. "She was smiling when I walked past," said Martha Price, who had the mercantile and the considered opinion of a businesswoman. "Through the window, just sitting there with his boots and smiling at them." "Smiling at his boots," repeated Helen DuPont, as though this needed emphasis. "I'm only saying what I saw." "He went in there because Walt's dead, and there's nowhere else in town," said Sylvia Crane. She said it with the certainty of a woman who had assessed the situation and found it untroubling. "It's a transaction. He needed boots fixed." "He stayed 20 minutes, said Martha. A brief silence. "How do you know how long he stayed?" said Dorothea. "I was in the barber." "Getting your hair done," said Helen, which made 2 of the other women hide smiles because Martha had been getting her hair done approximately once a week since Walt Greer's granddaughter had taken over the adjoining shop. Martha straightened slightly. "I happened to notice the time." Dorothea set down her teacup. She was 51 and had outlived 2 husbands, and she had the particular composure of a woman who had decided early in life that she would be comfortable and would make decisions accordingly. She had tried to win Cade Mercer's attention 4 years ago. Not desperately, but strategically, the way you'd approach a business arrangement, and had been politely refused, and she'd accepted the refusal with dignity and privately never forgiven him for it. "The girl is plain," she said, with the careful precision of someone stating a fact and not an opinion. "She's substantial. She has no family money, no property, no prospects beyond that little shop. She mends boots for a living." "She's Walt's blood," said a quieter voice from the corner of the room. That was Agnes Whitmore, who was the oldest woman in the circle and rarely spoke, but when she did, people generally listened. "Walt was a good man," Agnes said. "That girl worked beside him for 2 years before he died. She knows what she's doing." "Knowing how to fix boots," said Dorothea, "is not a quality that recommends a person." "It's a quality that recommends a person to a man whose boots need fixing," Agnes said, and picked up her tea. Dorothea looked at her for a moment. Then she changed the subject. But something had settled in her expression that wasn't quite resolved. Elira Boone woke at 5 in the morning, as she did every morning, in the small room behind the shop that she and her grandfather shared. It was a tight space, 2 narrow beds, a washstand, a trunk that held their clothes, a wood stove that ate through firewood at a rate that made her anxious every October when she calculated the winter ahead. A small window that faced east and let in the early light before any other window in the building caught it, which was the one luxury she'd found in an otherwise spare arrangement. Her grandfather, Walt, this was how she thought of it, carefully, because sick felt too small and dying felt too large, declining. The fall from the ladder in August had broken his hip. The hip had healed wrong. The pain had started keeping him awake, which meant he was sleeping during the day in irregular stretches that left him confused and irritable. He'd lost weight he didn't have to spare. The doctor had used words like secondary complications and prolonged recovery, and had looked at her with an expression she'd learned to read as "prepare yourself." She was preparing herself. She was also, simultaneously, running the shop, managing the household, buying food with money that was never quite enough, and pretending to her grandfather that everything was manageable, because he worried about her, and worry made his pain worse. This was her life, and she didn't say much about it because saying much about it didn't change any of it. She got up, dressed in the dark without waking him, added wood to the stove, checked that the soup from last night was still good. It was. And went into the shop to start work before the town woke up. Cade Mercer's boots were on her workbench. She'd been working on them each evening after the regular day's repairs were done, because she'd meant it when she said she wouldn't rush the welt stitching, but she'd also meant it when she said 2 days. Both things could be true if she used her evenings. She sat down, pulled the left boot into the good light from the lamp, and kept working. She'd noticed the unusual wear patterns the first evening, in that idle, noting without meaning to way she'd developed working beside her grandfather. Walt had always said that boots told you more about a man's life than his face did. He'd meant it as a general truth about character, the kind of thing old men said that was a little wise and a little sentimental. But these boots were telling her something more specific. The mud caked in the sole's tear, she'd been cleaning it out carefully, preserving the repair surface, was a particular color, not the dark brown of 3 notches lower pastures, which she knew from other boots that came in from the ranches. This was more reddish, mixed with a grayish clay that she associated with the Badlands north of town, the rocky, broken country that most ranch operators didn't run cattle through because the terrain was hard on the animals. There was also a cut on the heel counter, not the barbed wire cut, a different one, shallower, at a specific angle, that looked to her like it had come from a blade rather than wire or rock. Clean line, not torn. She thought about this. She was probably wrong. She wasn't a detective. She fixed boots, she went back to the welt stitching, but she kept thinking about it. Cade came back on the second day, mid-afternoon. She had his boots ready. She'd even polished them, which was not strictly part of the job, but she'd had the wax out anyway, and unpolished boots after a good repair felt like a half-finished sentence. He came through the door the same way he'd come the first time. No announcement, no particular ceremony, just a man entering a space where he needed to be. He looked around the shop the way she'd noticed he looked at things. Quick, thorough, cataloging. "Done?" he said. "Done." She held up the left boot. "Sole is solid. I used double thread on the welt, closer spacing than the original. It'll hold longer. Heel is corrected. The stitching near the toe I redid from scratch." She set it down and picked up the right one. "Right boot I reshaped slightly along the arch, because you were compensating for the uneven heel and it had started to affect your gait pattern. Should feel different for a day or two. That's normal." He took the right boot from her and looked at the arch. Then he sat on the bench and pulled both boots on with the practiced economy of someone who'd been doing it for 20 years. He stood up, walked to the door and back, stood still for a moment with his weight distributed evenly. "Huh," he said. She waited. "Left foot," he said. "It actually—" He stopped, seemed to decide against finishing whatever he'd been about to say. "They're good." Coming from Cade Mercer, she gathered, this was a meaningful statement. "There's something I want to ask you," she said. He looked at her. "The mud in the sole," she said. She kept her voice even because she wasn't entirely sure this was her business, and she was prepared to be told so. "It's from north of town, past the 3-notch north fence, up toward the red clay country. The brakes." A pause. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, but enough. "You were running cattle up there?" she asked. "At night?" "No," he said slowly. "I wasn't running cattle up there. The mud is from the brakes. I know what color the brakes mud is." "Then someone who was in the brakes walked through your property recently," she said. "And the cut on your heel counter. That's not barbed wire. Barbed wire leaves a specific kind of tear. That cut is from a blade, something with a short, clean edge." She hesitated. "I could be wrong about what it means, but I'm not wrong about what made it." He stood very still. She'd been watching his face the whole time she talked, because she was trying to judge whether this was useful to him or insulting. His face was difficult to read. She could see why people found him cold, because there wasn't a lot of surface movement. But there was something happening behind those gray-green eyes that she thought might be recalculation. "You found all this in the boots," he said. "My grandfather used to say that boots tell you more than faces." She paused. "I didn't fully believe him until recently." A very long moment. "The red clay," he said. "You're sure?" "Look." She picked up a small piece of leather she'd set aside, a scrap she'd used to clean the repair surface, and showed him the dried mud caked in it. "That's from your sole. Look at the color." He looked at it. He took the scrap from her and turned it in his fingers. He set it back down on her workbench without saying anything. Then he took out his wallet and counted out $3 and put them on the ledger exactly as she'd written it. "Thank you," he said, which was not what she'd expected. He picked up his boots. He was already wearing them, and she realized he meant thank you for the information, not for the boots, which she'd had ready before he got here. He went to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "Miss Boone," he said, without turning around. "Yes?" "Don't mention the mud to anyone." He left before she could answer. Bet. She stood in the empty shop for a moment after he was gone. Through the cracked and rawhide-patched window, she watched him untie his horse and mount in one smooth movement. He rode west, not back toward Three Notch, she realized. Northwest, toward the brakes. She turned back to her workbench. There was a pair of women's ankle boots waiting for new heel taps, and a man's work boot with a blown seam along the upper, and she had a list of 3 things to get from the hardware store before it closed and dinner to make for her grandfather. She picked up the ankle boots. She worked. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north, carrying the particular dry smell of the season turning, leaves and cold and something harder underneath, like iron, like the promise of a winter that wasn't going to be gentle. She stitched through it. She always did. 2 days later, the town found out that Cade Mercer had gone to Walt Greer's old shop for his boot repair, and the town had opinions about this, as it did about everything. The opinions fell mostly into 2 categories. The first, of course he did. There's nowhere else. The second, he talked to her for 20 minutes, Martha counted. Red Hollow was small enough that these 2 categories were held simultaneously by most people, with different emphasis depending on how the conversation was going and who was in the room. In Dorothea Hale's circle, the emphasis was increasingly on the second category. At the Three Notch, where Pete and Denny Marsh were the primary audience, the emphasis was on the first, though Pete had mentioned it twice, which was twice more than the first category warranted. She fixed the heel, Cade said, the second time Pete brought it up. I know, Pete said. I'm just saying she's Walt's girl. I know whose girl she is. She always seems smart. She is smart, Cade said, and went back to the tack he was mending, and Pete learned from his brother's expression that the topic was closed. What Pete and Denny didn't know, what no one in Red Hollow knew except Elira Boone herself, and she wasn't talking, was that Cade had ridden back north the day he'd picked up his boots and spent 4 hours walking the boundary between Three Notch's north pasture and the breaks. He'd found what he was looking for in the 3rd hour. A section of fence line that looked intact from a distance and was not intact up close. The wire had been cut and carefully rejoined with a splice that was designed to hold under casual inspection but release under pressure. Someone who knew what they were doing had done it. Someone who'd been careful. Beneath the fence, in a patch of soft ground that the previous night's cold had partially preserved, were boot prints. And beside one clear print where someone had crouched to work the splice, the reddish-gray mud of the brakes. He'd stood there for a long time in the cold wind. Then he'd ridden home and said nothing to Pete and Denny because what he was thinking required more evidence before it became an accusation. And accusations in a town of 400 had consequences that a man had to be careful about. He needed to know who was walking through the breaks and onto his land. What he hadn't figured out yet was how. The weather broke on Thursday. 3 days of cold rain turned the main street into its seasonal state of mud and inconvenience, kept most ranch operations to minimum necessity, and filled both saloons with men who would rather have been elsewhere. By Saturday, the sun was back, low and thin, giving light without particular warmth, and Red Hollow went back to its business with the slightly grim efficiency of a frontier town that didn't stop for weather and didn't pretend to enjoy the resuming. Elira's shop had a slow week, which was not unusual in bad weather. People stayed close, didn't wear their boots hard, had less occasion to bring them in. She used the time to catch up on the repair backlog that had been building since August, when she'd been spending her days at her grandfather's side in the hospital room the doctor had set up for the worst of his recovery. The backlog had shrunk by Friday. By Saturday, she was almost current. On Saturday afternoon, a shadow fell across her window. She looked up. Dorothea Hale was standing on the boardwalk outside, looking in. She had her good coat on, the gray wool one with the dark buttons, and the particular expression of a woman who had decided something and was executing the decision. Elira waited. Dorothea came in. "Miss Boone," she said. "Mrs. Hale. I have a pair of riding boots that need attention." Elira waited again because Dorothea Hale's good boots went to the cobbler in Buckton and everyone knew it. Dorothea set a pair of boots on the counter. They were fine boots, expensive leather, well made, with a small scuff on the toe of the left one that any woman could have buffed out at home with a damp cloth in a minute's effort. Elira looked at the scuff. She looked at Dorothea. "I can fix that," she said neutrally. "Thank you." Dorothea didn't leave. She looked around the shop with a careful, appraising gaze that felt more like assessment than interest. "You've kept it up well. Walt would be pleased." "I hope so." "He trained you himself." Yes. You're not formally apprenticed. There's no formal apprenticeship program in Red Hollow, Elira said. My grandfather trained me for 2 years. I know what I'm doing. I'm sure you do. Dorothea paused. Cade Mercer brought his boots here. There it was. Elira kept her hands still on the workbench. He did. The whole town knows. I imagine so. I want you to understand something, Miss Boone. Dorothea's voice was pleasant, measured, the way a controlled person's voice stayed pleasant when they were saying something that wasn't. Cade Mercer is a complicated man, with complicated circumstances. People in this town have a great deal invested in how his affairs go. His boots needed fixing, Elira said. I'm not questioning the boots, said Dorothea. I'm suggesting that complications can arise from misread situations, from people who aren't familiar with how things work here forming certain impressions. Elira looked at her directly. What impressions are you concerned about, Mrs. Hale? A beat. I wouldn't want to see you get hurt, Dorothea said, with the tone of a woman who had convinced herself this was true. I fixed his boots, Elira said. He paid his $3. That's the whole of the situation. Dorothea studied her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, the kind of nod that didn't indicate agreement so much as a decision to be done with the conversation. I'll be back for the boots tomorrow, she said. They'll be ready. Dorothea left. Elira waited until the shadow was gone from the window. Then she let out a slow breath through her nose, picked up the scuffed boot, and looked at it. She buffed the scuff out in 40 seconds. She set it down and went back to the work that actually needed doing. But her grandfather was awake when she came in that evening, which was not always the case anymore. He was sitting up in bed, which was also not always the case, and he had his good color, the color he got when the pain was manageable and his mind was clear. You're tired, he said, before she'd said anything. I'm fine, Grandpa. You're tired, and something's bothering you. He had always been able to read her this way, from the time she was a child. She'd never learned to hide it from him, which meant she'd more or less stopped trying. She sat in the chair beside his bed. Dorothea Hale came in today. Walt was quiet for a moment. Then, what did she want? She had a scuffed boot. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Dorothea Hale has never had a scuffed boot in 30 years. I know. What was she really after? Elira folded her hands in her lap. She wanted to tell me, politely, to stay away from Cade Mercer. Walt was quiet again. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind was doing its October thing against the walls, finding every gap. Cade brought his boots in, Walt said. I heard about that. News travels. In Red Hollow, news doesn't travel. It teleports. A pause. How are his boots? Good leather. Hard used. He knows what real work looks like. She hesitated. I noticed something in the repair. Tell me. She told him about the mud, about the cut on the heel counter, about what she'd said to Cade and what he'd said back. Walt listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd always loved about him. The man knew how to hear something out. When she finished, he was quiet for a bit. You were right to tell him, he said finally. I wasn't sure it was my place. Boots tell a story, he said. I taught you that. If the story matters to someone's life and safety, and you're the one who can read it. He stopped, shifted against his pillow, and she watched him find the position that hurt least. Staying quiet isn't neutral, Elira. It just means you let whatever's coming arrive without warning. She looked at her hands. Dorothea's afraid, Walt said. That's all that is. Women like her, they've got their world arranged very precisely, and something that doesn't fit the arrangement frightens them. I don't fit the arrangement. No, he agreed, without apology or softness about it, just acknowledgement. You don't. You never have. He met her eyes. That is not a flaw, girl. Don't let anyone make you think it is. She stayed with him until he fell asleep, which didn't take long. The good days still exhausted him. Then she went back to the shop, turned up the lamp, and worked until the hands of the clock on the wall reached 11. The following Monday, 3 more of Cade's cattle went missing. He found out at dawn when Pete did the count and came to the house door with a look on his face like he'd swallowed something bad. North pasture again, Pete said. How many? 3, maybe 4. I want to do it again to be sure. Cade stood in the doorway with his coffee cup and looked north, where the sky was the pale gray-white of an early morning that hadn't decided yet whether it would be a good day or a difficult one. The grass was silver with frost. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. "Don't bother counting twice," he said. "It's 3. He went inside, finished his coffee, and made a decision. He rode into town that afternoon. He told himself he was going to the hardware store for fence staples, which he genuinely needed. He also told himself, in the honest, private way that a man who had no one else to be honest with had to be honest with himself, that he was going past the boot shop and he was going to stop. Go. She was alone in the shop when he came in. The afternoon light was coming through the east window at a low angle, and she was bent over a harness repair that someone had brought in instead of going to the proper saddler, a thing that happened occasionally because the saddler was on the other side of town and the boot shop was closer to the main street. She looked up. He closed the door behind him. "More cattle," he said. "How many?" 3. Same fence line. He sat on the bench without being invited to, which was the kind of thing he'd never done before. But the bench was there. "Someone is running them north into the breaks and disappearing. I found the splice in the fence. Repaired it 3 days ago. They cut a new section 10 feet over." She set down the harness strap. "Someone who knows your land," she said. "Well enough, and patient, and organized." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. This isn't one person, is it? It wasn't a question. "No," he said. "It's not one person." "Have you talked to the sheriff?" The look he gave her answered that. "Right," she said. The fire in the small stove popped. Outside, 2 men were having a conversation on the boardwalk that they probably thought was private. "The breaks," she said. "If they're running cattle through there, they need somewhere to bring them. You can't hold cattle in the breaks. There's no water to speak of, and the terrain won't let you manage a herd. They'd have to come out the other side. North side comes out near Garnet Creek," he said. "And Garnet Creek goes east toward—" She stopped. "Yeah," he said. "The Lacey property, which has been empty since John Lacey moved his family to California 6 months ago." They looked at each other. The empty Lacey property had a holding pen, Elira remembered. She'd been out there twice with her grandfather when Walt had been doing some repair work for John Lacey years back. It had a good holding pen and a barn and access to Garnet Creek for water. "You can't go out there alone," she said. "I wasn't planning to tonight." "You need to know who," she said, "before you do anything. If you go out there without knowing who's behind this and something happens to you, they'll call it an accident, or they'll say you were drunk, or they'll find some way to—" She stopped again because she was getting into territory that wasn't her business, that she didn't have a claim on. But he was looking at her with that still, concentrated attention, and he didn't tell her to stop. "You need to know who," she said again, "and you need someone who can back up what you find, a witness." "I'm aware of that." "Who do you trust in this town?" He looked at her steadily, then slowly he said, "That list is shorter than it should be." She understood him. She wasn't sure, sitting there in her small, cluttered shop with her rough hands and her grandfather asleep in the next room, and her ledger that barely balanced, and her life that fit in a space most people would consider inadequate. She wasn't sure she was what he meant, but she thought maybe she was. She turned back to the harness strap. "I closed the shop at 6, she said. He waited. "The breaks have an access trail off the Miller Road," she said, not looking up. 2 miles north. I know because I walked it once with my grandfather when I was 14, and he wanted to show me what clay soil looked like up close because he was teaching me about leather treatment. There's a ridge line that overlooks the Lacey property's north side from about a 1/4 mile. She stitched. He said nothing. "I'm good at not being noticed," she said, matter-of-factly. "Not self-pity, just a report on reality. People in this town look through me most of the time. That can be useful." A very long pause. "It's not safe," he said. "No," she agreed. "If I'm right about who's behind this, I know." "You'd be putting yourself—" "I know." She looked up at him. "I'm not asking for your permission, Mr. Mercer. I'm telling you what I know and what I can do. What you decide to do with that is your affair." He looked at her for a long time with that unreadable gray-green gaze. Then he stood up. "Wednesday night," he said, "if the weather holds. I'll come past the shop at 8. He went to the door. "Mr. Mercer," she said. He turned. She reached under the workbench and held out the scrap of leather with the dried reddish mud still caked in it, the piece she'd set aside when she'd cleaned his boot soles. Evidence, she said. He took it from her. His fingers, reaching for it, were close to hers for a moment, rough skin scarred along the right palm. He took the scrap without a word. He left. She sat for a moment in the shop after he was gone. The fire popped. The harness strap waited. She wasn't afraid exactly. She was something more complicated than afraid. Something that had several things inside it. Fear, yes, but also a recognition. The feeling of a door she hadn't known was there opening just slightly, enough to show that there was something beyond it. Something that looked like it was worth the walk toward. She picked up the harness strap. She worked. Outside, October pressed against the windows, cold and patient, and Red Hollow went about its evening, and no one who passed the little boot shop on the east end of Main Street would have thought that anything in particular was happening inside it. They would have been wrong. Wednesday came in cold and clear, the kind of night where the stars looked close enough to touch, and the temperature dropped fast once the sun went down. By 7 o'clock, the air had a bite to it that went straight through wool, and Elira had layered everything she owned that could reasonably be called warm. 2 shirts, her grandfather's old canvas work jacket that was too big across the shoulders and smelled faintly of pine oil, and a wool scarf she'd mended so many times the original color was mostly gone. She'd told her grandfather she was checking on a leather delivery that had come in late. It wasn't entirely a lie. There had been a delivery, and she had checked it before 5 o'clock when the light was still good. But it was the kind of truth that did the work of a lie, which she felt bad about in a quiet, practical way that didn't stop her from doing it. Walt was having a harder day. The cold got into his hip the way weather does when something in the body has healed badly, finding the fault line and pressing on it. He'd been in and out of sleep since noon, and when he was awake, his eyes had that foggy, distant look that meant the pain was taking the front of his mind. She'd made sure the fire was banked and there was water on the nightstand and the lamp was turned low enough that the light wouldn't keep him awake. She'd stood in the doorway of his room for a moment, watching his chest rise and fall. She hadn't let herself think too long about what she was walking toward. At 8:05, she heard hooves on the boardwalk side of the street, unhurried. She locked the shop door, put the key in her coat pocket, and stepped out into the cold. Cade was on his horse and leading a second animal, a steady-looking roan mare that Elira had seen tied outside 3 Notch when she'd ridden past on errands. He handed her the reins without ceremony. He looked at her layered jacket and scarf and said nothing, which she took as acceptance. She mounted without asking for help. She wasn't graceful about it. The roan was taller than she'd expected, and the canvas jacket made her arms stiff, and she had to use more effort than she'd have liked to get herself up. But she got up, and she settled, and she gathered the reins, and she looked at Cade. He had already turned his horse north. She followed. They rode in silence out of town, which suited her. The main street was quiet at that hour. A few lit windows in the saloons, a lantern at the livery, the distant sound of a piano playing something that had been a recognizable tune once. Once they cleared the last building, the dark came in properly, wide and clean under the stars, and the only sounds were hoofbeats and wind moving through the dry grass on either side of the road. After about a mile, Cade said, without turning his head, "You ride." "My grandfather had a horse when I was young." She paused. "Before money got difficult." "When was that?" "I was 11. A pause on her end. "Things were different when my grandmother was alive. After she went, the shop did well enough, but it was just the 2 of us, and Walt was never very organized about money. He was good at the work, not the business." She stopped because she'd said more than she'd intended to, and she wasn't sure why, except that the dark made it easier somehow. "Doesn't matter." "It does, a little," he said. She looked at his profile. He was watching the road. "Why?" she said. "Because you've been running that shop on nothing for longer than people think." He said it plain, no particular inflection. "And you're still running it." She didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that wasn't either self-pitying or falsely modest, and she was tired of both. The Miller Road forked 1.5 miles out of town. Cade took the left branch without hesitating, and the trail narrowed, the brush closing in on both sides. The ground was beginning to change, harder, stonier, the grass giving way to the rocky scrub that indicated they were approaching the breaks. The horses picked their footing carefully. "The splice I found," Cade said after a while. I marked the location. There were 3 separate sets of boot prints around it. Different soles. One had a flat heel, one had a riding heel like mine, one was something between. He paused. The flat heel is the one that worries me. Why? Work boots. Not riding boots, not dress boots. A man who works in flat boots out here is a ranch hand. She thought about that. Someone on your payroll? Or someone who used to be? The trail opened slightly as they climbed, and she could see the ridgeline he'd mentioned, a long, dark elevation against the star-filled sky, maybe a quarter-mile ahead. Below it, invisible from here, but present in her memory from that childhood walk, was the flat country of the Lacey property. They left the horses tied to a stand of scrub pine below the ridge and went the last stretch on foot. Cade moved through the dark like he'd been doing it for years, which he probably had. Low, unhurried, his boots quiet on the stone. Alira was less quiet, her heavier frame and the stiff canvas jacket working against stealth. But she paid attention to where he put his feet, and she copied him as best she could. And by the time they reached the ridge's crest, she hadn't fallen or knocked anything loud over, which she counted as acceptable. They lay flat at the top and looked down. The Lacey property's north end was about 250 yards below. She estimated from the way the cold air pooled in the lower ground. The barn was dark. The holding pen was not. There were cattle in it. She couldn't count exactly, but there were enough animals that their collective warmth was steaming faintly in the cold air, visible as a low haze above the fence line. A lantern burned inside the barn, throwing a thin line of yellow light under the door. Cade was so still beside her that she could almost forget he was there. His breathing was controlled and even. He was counting. She could tell from the slight movement of his lips and the way his eyes tracked across the pen. After a long moment, he said, very quietly, 22. She looked at him. I'm missing 22 head, he said. Over 6 weeks. They watched. After about 10 minutes, the barn door opened and a man came out. He was carrying the lantern, which made him easy to see. Medium build, heavy coat, hat pulled down. He walked the perimeter of the pen, checking the fence, not in a hurry. Checked the gate latch. Walked back to the barn. Before he went in, he turned and said something to someone inside. A second voice answered. She couldn't make out the words, but she caught the tone. Casual, familiar, the register of 2 men who'd been working together long enough to stop being formal. Then a third voice from somewhere she couldn't see, farther inside the barn, or possibly outside on the south side. 3 voices. 3 men, minimum. Cade was absolutely motionless beside her. She could feel the controlled tension in him, the effort of keeping still when everything in him probably wanted to move, to act, to solve the problem in the direct physical way that a man like Cade would have been inclined toward. She understood that impulse. She also understood why he wasn't following it. 3 men against 1 was bad math. 3 men who'd been operating carefully for 6 weeks, who had contacts and planning behind them, was worse math. They lay on the ridge for another 40 minutes. The cold went through her jacket and through the shirts under it and into her bones in a way that made her jaw ache from keeping her teeth from chattering. She focused on breathing and watching. One more man came out of the barn, stockier than the first. He stood outside for a while, smoking, the ember of his cigarette marking his position in the dark. Then he went back in. 4 men. On the ride back down from the ridge, Cade said, "You recognize the third voice." She stopped. He had his horse by the reins and he was looking at her in the dark, and she realized he'd been watching her the same way she'd been watching the barn, carefully, cataloging. "How did you know?" she said. "Your face changed." She had recognized the third voice. She'd been trying to figure out if she was certain, because certain mattered, and she wasn't quite there. But there was something in the cadence, the particular way a sound carried in cold air, the shape of a short word she'd half heard that had made her stomach go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I'm not sure enough to say," she said. "Best guess." She looked at her horse's neck for a moment. "There's a man named Garrett Cole. He supplies leather to my shop. He's a middleman for a tanner outside Buckton. I've dealt with him 6 or 7 times. She paused. "He came in last week. Not for business. He was asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "About you." She made herself look at Cade directly. "Whether you'd been in, what you'd needed, whether we'd talked much." She'd dismissed it at the time as gossip gathering, the same thing half the town did. Now she wasn't sure. I told him you'd needed a repair and paid your bill. He asked if you'd said anything about the north pasture. Cade was very still. I told him no, she said, because at that point it was true. You hadn't mentioned the north pasture to me. You'd just left and told me not to mention the mud. She paused. He seemed satisfied. Coal supplies leather to half the operations in this county, Cade said slowly. He goes everywhere. Every ranch, every shop. Nobody thinks twice about seeing his wagon. He'd know every property, every fence line, whose land bordered whose. Cade looked out toward the dark north. And he moves cattle through. Nobody questions a man with a supply wagon who sometimes has animals tied behind it. She nodded. I still can't be certain it was his voice, she said. The distance? You're certain enough, he said. I can see it. She supposed he was right. She wouldn't have said it aloud if she wasn't mostly sure, and they both knew it. They rode back toward town without talking for a while. Somewhere around the Miller Road fork, Cade said, You need to be careful about Cole. I was already planning to be. I mean, if he was asking about you and me, he knows you're involved somehow, or suspects. He wouldn't have come to the shop otherwise. She'd thought about that too, in the 40 minutes on the cold ridge. The shape of it had been sitting in the back of her mind, uncomfortable and unignorable. I know. If he thinks you told me something, I know, Cade. She used his name without thinking about it, which she noticed only after she'd done it. He glanced at her. She didn't apologize for it. They rode. There were 2 other things I wanted to tell you, she said, after another minute. About Cole, specifically. I remembered them on the ridge. She'd actually remembered them the moment she'd recognized the voice, but she'd needed the ride down to sort them into order. The leather he sold me last time, it was misgraded. He told me it was second-quality harness leather. It wasn't. It was good leather, top quality, priced as second. He was moving it cheap, which means he either got it somewhere he shouldn't have, or he was in a hurry to place it and didn't want questions. She paused. Either way, he's cutting corners somewhere he didn't used to. And the second thing? He asked me, when he was in the shop last week, if I knew anything about the land situation north of 3 Notch. She looked at Cade. He asked specifically whether you'd ever tried to extend your north fence line. Cade's jaw tightened slightly. Why would he care about that? My first thought was that it was just conversation. He talks a lot, always asking about everyone's business. She paused. But if someone's using the Lacey property, if they have an arrangement there, and if you were to extend your fence line north, you'd be cutting off the access trail through the breaks. They'd lose the route, or they'd need you gone before you did it. She let that sit. He rode in silence for a long time, long enough that she wondered if she'd miscalculated, pushed the interpretation further than the evidence actually went. She was good at reading boot leather, at tracing mud and blade angles. She was less practiced at this, at reading the shape of a conspiracy, at understanding what men with money and patience were capable of. But then Cade said quietly, 6 weeks ago, I had a conversation with my lawyer about the north fence line, about what it would cost to extend it. She looked at him. 3 people knew about it. My lawyer, Pete, and Denny. He paused. And whoever Pete or Denny mentioned it to. Pete talks, she said, because she'd heard this. Pete Marsh was a friendly man, the kind of man who chatted at the hardware store and the saloon, who shared information without thinking of it as sharing information. Pete talks, Cade agreed, with a weight in his voice that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite exhaustion, but was somewhere between the two. They reached the edge of town. The saloons were still lit. It was coming on 10 o'clock. The rest of Main Street was dark and quiet, shuttered against the cold. Cade walked his horse alongside her as they turned east toward the shop. At the hitching post, she dismounted, less gracefully than getting on had been, her legs stiff from the cold and the time on the ridge, and handed him the roan's reins. I'll ride past the Lacey property tomorrow, he said. North side in daylight. See what I can see without going on to the property. Be careful how you do that, she said. If Cole or anyone watching sees you near the Lacey land, I know. I'm serious. So am I. He looked at her. Stay away from Cole if he comes back to the shop. Tell him you're out of stock. Tell him you've switched suppliers. Tell him anything. And if he doesn't believe me, then tell me immediately. She nodded. She was tired. The cold and the tension had run through her energy faster than she'd expected, and she was thinking about her grandfather's fire and whether it had stayed banked, and about the shop door lock that had been sticking lately and whether she'd gotten it properly closed. "Miss Boone," he said. She paused with her hand on the shop door. "What you noticed in those boots, the mud, the cut." He said it carefully, like a man choosing words with more than usual attention. "Most people wouldn't have seen it." She was quiet for a moment. "Walt taught me to look at the whole thing," she said. "Not just the part that's broken, the whole boot, the whole story." She pulled her key from her pocket. "He said a good repair starts with understanding what the boot has been through, not just what you need to fix." Cade held the two horses and said nothing. "Good night," she said. "Lock the back door too," he said. "Not just the front." She went inside. She did lock the back door. She checked on her grandfather. Still sleeping, breathing steady, fire still warm. She pulled off the canvas jacket and the extra shirt and hung them on their hooks in the dark, moving quietly the way she'd learned to do in this small space without waking him. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a little while, not sleeping. She was turning over the shape of it, the cattle, the splice and the fence, Cole's questions, the voices in the dark, the Lacey holding pen, the 22 animals standing in steam in the cold, the way it all fit together into something organized and patient and deliberately hidden. And the way Cade Mercer had looked at her on the ridge when her face had changed. She'd been looked at her whole life in ways that amounted to not being seen at all. The widow's circle who looked through her when they passed the shop, the men who talked over her head at the supply counter, the customers who left their boots with a perfunctory thanks and didn't look up, even the well-meaning people, the ones who said, "Good girl," and Walt's keeping her on, and she does a decent job for someone with no real training. They were looking at an idea of her, not her. Cade had looked at her on that ridge the same way he'd looked at everything else important, like he was actually seeing it. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She lay down. The wind pressed against the walls. Her grandfather breathed in the next room with that slow, labored rhythm she'd memorized the way you memorize something you're afraid of losing. Sleep came eventually, and it wasn't peaceful exactly, but it was deep. Across town, in the saloon nearest the livery, a man named Garrett Cole sat at a corner table with a glass in front of him and a careful, watchful expression on his face. He'd been watching the east end of Main Street through the window for about 40 minutes. He'd seen a woman in a canvas jacket come back to the boot shop at nearly 10 o'clock. He'd seen whose horse she'd been riding alongside. He finished his glass, set it down, and thought about that for a long time. Outside, October had turned fully mean. The temperature had dropped another 6 degrees since sundown, and the stars that had looked so clear and close earlier had started disappearing behind a thin cloud cover moving in from the north. The kind of clouds that didn't always mean weather, but sometimes did. Sometimes did. The clouds that had been moving in from the north on Wednesday night delivered on their quiet threat by Friday morning. Not snow, not yet, but a hard, driving sleet that turned the main street back into its worst version of itself and kept most of Red Hollow indoors with their opinions and their fires. Elira had 4 customers before noon and none after. She used the empty afternoon to work through the backlog, which was almost gone now, and to think, which she'd been doing more of than was probably useful. Cade had sent no word since Wednesday night. She hadn't expected any. They'd made no arrangements beyond what they'd discussed, and he wasn't a man who communicated for the sake of communicating. But the silence had a weight to it that she noticed, the way you noticed a tooth that was starting to ache. Not constant, just present enough that you kept finding it. Garrett Cole came into the shop at 2:30. She heard the bell and looked up and felt something in her chest go carefully, deliberately still. The way you went still when something startled you and you needed to not show it. "Miss Boone," he said. He was smiling. Cole was always smiling, a wide, easy smile that had probably served him well for years in his traveling salesman life, moving between ranches and shops with his wagon and his leather samples and his easy patter. He was 50 or so, thick through the middle, with a gray beard he kept neat and small hands for a big man. "Miserable day." "It is," she said. "I was in the area, thought I'd stop by. See if you needed anything." He set his hat on the corner of her counter. She noticed he didn't ask, and looked around the shop with that casual, cataloging attention she now read differently than she had 2 weeks ago. Busy week? Steady enough. Good, good. He looked at the work on her bench. A man's dress boot, the upper separating from the sole along the toe box. Welting problem. Hand-stitched original. The thread dried out. Shame. Good boot otherwise. He was leaning slightly to look at it, and she recognized the angle of his interest as something more specific than conversation. Average, she said. Whose is it? She kept her hands moving, her voice even. Customers. I don't discuss customers. Of course. The smile didn't change. That's professional of you. He straightened up, put his hands in his coat pockets. I've got a new shipment coming through next week. Good harness leather, proper graded this time. I think there was a mix-up with your last delivery. There was, she said, but I've made other arrangements. A slight pause. Not long, but a breath's worth. Other arrangements. I found a supplier out of Millhaven who delivers directly. Better price, no middleman. She said it with the tired practicality of a woman making sensible business decisions, which was the tone she'd practiced in her head twice this morning. Nothing personal, Mr. Cole. Just economics. Cole looked at her for a moment. The smile was still there, but something behind it had shifted. A slight recalibration, like a man adjusting his weight from one foot to the other. That's a shame, he said. We've had a good arrangement. We have. I appreciate the years of business. Another pause. He was looking at the dress boot on her bench. I heard Mercer was in again this week. She felt her hands want to stop and made them keep moving. You hear a lot, Mr. Cole. Small town. He shrugged. People talk. Seems like he's become a regular. He was in once, she said. I told you that last week. Right. He picked up his hat from the counter. I saw his horse tied out front on Tuesday is all. Tuesday. She hadn't seen Cade on Tuesday, but she hadn't been watching for him either. She'd been in the back doing inventory most of that morning. I couldn't tell you what he ties his horse to, she said. I don't monitor the street. Cole looked at her with the smile and the something else beneath it, and she looked back at him with the mild, slightly tired expression of a woman who had more work than time and no particular interest in being detained. He put his hat on. Well, you know where to find me if the Millhaven arrangement doesn't work out. I do. Thank you for stopping by. He left. She waited until his footsteps faded and the cold air from the open door had settled back into the shop's warmth. Then she set down the boot she'd been stitching and looked at her hands. They were steady. She was actually a little surprised by that. She pulled on her coat and locked the shop and walked 2 blocks west in the sleet to the telegraph office, which was the only place in Red Hollow where she could get a message out quickly that Garrett Cole couldn't intercept. She wrote it on the small form the operator provided. Cole was in the shop today, asking about Tuesday. He knows something. E.B. She addressed it to 3 Notch Ranch. She paid the 12 cents and walked back through the sleet and went back to work. The response came this following morning, hand-delivered by Denny Marsh, who arrived at the shop door before she'd opened and handed her a folded note, with the unsmiling efficiency of a man who'd been told to be quick about it. The note said, Stay in the shop today. I'll come by this evening. Don't talk to Cole again. CM, she read it twice, noticed the economy of it. No wasted words, no explanation she hadn't needed, and put it in her coat pocket. She stayed in the shop. He came by at 7, after dark. He didn't tie his horse at the front. She heard him come around to the back alley, the quieter route, and she let him in through the rear door that she'd only ever used for taking out leather scraps. He looked tired. Not in a way he showed on his face exactly, but in the set of his shoulders, the slight tightness around his eyes. She recognized it because she'd seen that kind of tired in her own mirror enough times, the specific exhaustion of a person who'd been carrying something heavy in silence for too long. Cole went to the sheriff today, he said, before he'd fully gotten through the door. She stared at him. He filed a complaint, said he'd seen your shop light on past midnight 3 nights this week, and he was concerned about the fire risk, and could the sheriff do a welfare check on the property? He said it with a flatness that indicated he found this remarkable. Burke went, looked around, said everything was fine. That's not about fire risk, she said. No, it's Cole establishing a reason to have your shop looked at. Officially. He came inside properly, and she closed the back door. If there's ever anything in here that he wants to claim he found legitimately, There's nothing here to find. I know that, but there will be once we have what we need. He looked at her steadily. That scrap of leather with the brake's mud? You still have it? No, you took it Wednesday. Right. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she hadn't seen from him before. Unguarded. I rode out to the Lacey property north side yesterday, far enough out to sea without trespassing. They moved the cattle already. Pen was empty. She processed that. They knew you'd come looking, or they were moving them anyway. They can't hold stolen cattle on an empty property forever. Eventually, someone asked questions about the Lacey land. Someone sees the pen occupied. He sat on the bench by the door, which she was coming to think of as his bench, the way regular customers had their spots. But it means we've got less time than I thought. They'll scatter the animals, sell them through wherever they're selling them, and then there's no physical evidence left. The splice in your fence, which I repaired, my fingerprints are on it now more than theirs. She sat down across from him on her work stool. Her grandfather was asleep. She'd checked twice in the past hour. So we need something else. I talked to my lawyer, a man named Fenn in Buckton, the only attorney I trust. He says I need documented evidence of the operation. Chain of custody, provable ownership, names attached to the physical crime. He paused. Which means I need to catch them in the act of moving the cattle. Not just a holding pen, the actual transfer. She was quiet for a moment, working through the logistics of that, the way she worked through the mechanics of a difficult repair. Start from what you know, find the sequence, identify where it breaks. Cole's wagon, she said slowly. He moves leather, supplies. Everybody sees him on every road in the county, and nobody thinks twice. She looked at Cade. How do they sell them? The cattle. They can't just walk 20 head into a stockyard. Someone would trace the brands. They alter the brands first. She hadn't thought of that. That takes time, and equipment, a running iron, somewhere to work. She paused. And someone who knows what they're doing well enough that the alteration passes inspection. Someone with experience in the cattle trade, Cade said, with a particular weight on the word someone. She looked at him. There's a man on the county land board named Ellis Price, he said. Martha Price's brother-in-law. He ran a cattle operation for 15 years before he moved into land administration. He knows brands, he knows the recording system, he knows every inspector in the district. He stopped. 6 months ago, he started pushing a proposal to rezone the land north of 3 Notch, reclassify it as public grazing territory, which would open up the breaks to anyone, and remove any legal basis I'd have to extend my north fence. He was quiet for a moment. I thought it was just politics. Land board people push zoning proposals all the time. Half of them go nowhere. I didn't think much of it. She was connecting things now, the way she connected the parts of a boot, each piece attached to the next. The whole thing only stable when everything was properly joined. Cole moving product between operations, knowing every fence line and every property. Ellis Price on the land board, positioned to remove Cade's ability to close off the route. The Lacey property sitting empty at the junction of the breaks in Garnet Creek. Who owns the operation they're selling to? She said. That's what I don't know. That's the piece at the center. They sat with that for a moment. The fire in the stove popped and settled. Outside, the sleet had stopped, but the cold had gotten deeper and quieter, the kind of cold that came from clear skies after clouds, all insulation gone. Mr. Cole asked whose boot was on my bench, she said. He wanted to know if it was yours. I know. Which means he's watching to see how often you're in contact with me. She paused. Which means he's worried about what I might have said or noticed. Which means he knows I'm not just a boot mender, at this point, in terms of my relationship to this situation. Cade looked at her with that direct, uncomfortable attention. If he decides I'm a liability, she said, rather than just someone to watch, I've thought about that. Have you thought about what to do about it? A silence. She could hear him working through it, even though his face didn't give much away. The slight tension in his jaw. The way his hands resting on his knees were still but not relaxed. I want you to move your grandfather, he said finally. Temporarily. There's a woman named Ruth Hennessy where she takes in boarders. She's on the south end of town, away from Cole's usual route. I'd pay for 2 weeks. My grandfather isn't going to... I know he's not going to like it. I'm telling you what I think is necessary. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them moved. He's sick, she said. Moving him is hard on him. Staying where you are is harder if this goes wrong. She wanted to argue with that, and she couldn't, which was its own kind of frustrating. He'll ask questions. Tell him the shop has a heating problem. Tell him you're doing maintenance on the stove. Cade said it like he'd thought about it already. You said yourself you're good at the kind of truth that does the work of a lie. She stared at him. He held her gaze, not apologetic, but not unkind either. I didn't say that, she said. Not those words. She'd said something close enough. She looked away. 2 weeks is a long time. I'm hoping we won't need 2 weeks. She rubbed her hands together. They were cold, despite the stove, and thought about her grandfather's breathing in the next room, the labored sound of it, the particular vulnerability of a man who was in pain and didn't always know what time it was. She thought about what Cole had done with the sheriff, about Cole's small, careful hands and the smile that didn't reach all the way. All right, she said. Cade nodded once. I need to tell you something else, she said. I didn't mention it Wednesday because I wasn't sure it was relevant. I'm still not sure. She looked at the stove. 2 years ago, before my grandfather's accident, a man came into the shop wanting Walt to do specialized work, custom boot construction, unusual specifications. A specific heel modification that Walt said afterward was designed to make a man's gait unidentifiable, disguise the way he walked. She paused. Walt didn't take the job. He said the man made him uncomfortable and he had enough work. Do you know who the man was? Walt didn't tell me his name, but he described him. Thick through the middle, small hands, very neat beard. She looked at Cade. Walt said he smiled the whole time, even when Walt refused the work. Cade was very still. That's Cole, he said. That's what I think. 2 years ago. Cole has been planning this for at least 2 years. She nodded. And Walt, my grandfather, Walt refused to help him, which means Cole knows that Walt knew something. She said it carefully because it led somewhere she'd been afraid to follow all the way. And Walt fell off a ladder in August. The room was very quiet. She wasn't accusing anyone of anything. She was putting pieces in sequence, the way she'd learned to do, and trying to be honest with herself about where the sequence went. Cade looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not pity. She would have found that unbearable. Something harder than pity and more respectful. You should have told me this earlier, he said. I know. Do you believe it? That it wasn't an accident? She pressed her lips together. I don't know. I don't have any evidence beyond pattern, and I might be seeing connections because I want them to exist, because it would make more sense than just a ladder and bad luck. She exhaled. I don't know. Your grandfather is moving to Ruth Hennessy's tomorrow, Cade said. He said it quietly, but with a finality that wasn't really open to renegotiation. I'll have Denny help with the transport. She didn't argue. He stood up, put his hat back on, turned the brim in his fingers once, a small, restless gesture. There's a livestock auction in Garrison next Thursday. Regional event, draws buyers from 3 counties. If Cole's operation is moving altered cattle for sale, that auction is the most likely venue. It's big enough to hide a transaction, small enough that you don't need a large legitimate operation to enter animals. You're going. I'm going. He looked at her. I need someone who can identify Cole on sight, and who Cole doesn't expect to see there, standing where they can watch the sale pens without being obvious. He paused. I need someone Cole would look straight past. She understood what he was saying. She also understood, with a clarity that was not comfortable, that he wasn't wrong. In a crowd of ranchers and buyers, Cade Mercer would be watched, recognized, noted. A large, plain-faced young woman in work clothes, standing at the fence of a sale pen, looking at cattle. She was furniture. She was invisible in exactly the way that was useful right now. She'd been invisible her whole life for reasons that had nothing to do with strategy. It had taken until this week, in this conversation, in this spare room behind a boot shop, to find a situation where that invisibility was something she could use rather than simply endure. Thursday, she said. Thursday, he confirmed. He went out the back door. She listened to his footsteps fade into the alley, and then the muffled sound of his horse moving away through the frozen mud, and then nothing but the wind and the fire and her grandfather's breathing. She sat for a long moment in the quiet shop. Then she got up, went to the back room, and checked that her grandfather's blankets were properly tucked, and that the water was within reach, and that the fire would hold through the night. His eyes opened when she straightened up. "Elira," he said in that foggy, half-present way. "I'm here," she said. He looked at her for a moment. His eyes were clearer than she expected. "You're doing something," he said. She looked at him. "I can tell," he said. "You've got that face." He shifted against the pillow. "The one you had when you were 12 and you decided to fix the roof yourself." "I fell off the roof. You fixed it first." A pause. "And then you fell off it." He closed his eyes again. "Be careful, girl." She pulled the blanket up. "I will," she said. She went back to her workbench and picked up the dress boot with the failing welt stitching, and she worked until the fire needed another log, and then she worked a little longer after that, and the night settled around Red Hollow like something that was waiting. Moving Walt to Ruth Hennessy's took most of Sunday morning and was exactly as difficult as Elira had expected. Her grandfather was not a man who complained loudly. He complained the way a lot of old men complained, through silence, through the specific quality of his breathing, through the angle of his jaw when he was being asked to do something he'd already decided he didn't want to do. He got himself dressed without help, which took 20 minutes and cost him, and he sat on the edge of his bed looking at the room around him with the expression of a man who understood more than he was being told. Denny Marsh had brought a wagon with a proper seatboard and enough blankets to pad it, which Elira was grateful for. He was a quieter man than his brother, Denny, less inclined to fill space with words, more inclined to simply do what was needed. He helped Walt from the back room to the wagon with a matter-of-fact steadiness that didn't make the old man feel handled, which was a harder thing to manage than it sounded. Walt said nothing until they were on the wagon and moving south through the cold morning air. Then he said, "It's not the stove." Elira kept her eyes on the road ahead. "The flu's been backing up for weeks. I need to have it properly cleaned before—" "Elira," she stopped. "I'm old," he said. "Not stupid." She looked at him. His face was tired and pale from the effort of getting ready, but his eyes were clear in the cold air, clearer than they'd been in days. "I know that. Is it the man you were telling me about? Mercer." "It's connected to him, yes." "Are you safe?" She considered lying and decided she was too tired for it. "I'm taking precautions." He looked at her for a long moment. This man who had raised her, who had taught her to read leather and to look at whole things instead of just the broken parts, who had built a small life in a small shop and made sure she understood that small didn't mean lesser. "The man who came in 2 years ago," he said suddenly. She went very still. "The one who wanted the custom heels," Walt said. "I've been thinking about him since August." He paused. "That fall. I've been thinking about the ladder. Whether I put it where I put it, whether there was something—" He stopped. "I'm an old man and I might be imagining things." "You might be," she said carefully. "But you don't think I am." She didn't answer that. She reached over and put her hand over his, which were folded on his knees, rough-knuckled and spotted with age, hands that had mended 10,000 things. He turned his palm up and held hers for a moment. "Ruth Hennessy is a good woman," he said finally. "Her beef stew is better than yours." She almost smiled. "That's not a high bar." "No," he agreed. "It really isn't." Ruth Hennessy was 63 and ran her boarding house with the quiet authority of a woman who had managed difficult people for 30 years and was no longer impressed by any of it. She had a room on the ground floor, no stairs, which mattered, with a south-facing window that got afternoon light. She asked no questions about why Walt was there and showed no particular curiosity about when he'd leave, which were both qualities Elira valued more than she could say. She left her grandfather in the ground floor room with his books and his blankets and his slightly better view of the winter sky, and she rode back to the shop through streets that were still mostly empty at mid-morning. She opened the shop at 10. She had 3 customers by noon. She did the work and kept her face neutral and her answers brief. And when Dorothea Hale walked past the window at 1:30 and looked in, Elira looked up and nodded and went back to the harness she was splicing. She was learning, she thought, that the best disguise was just being exactly who you already were. Thursday came in on a gray sky that couldn't decide between clouds and clearing. Garrison was 14 miles east. A bigger town than Red Hollow by about 300 people, with a proper stockyard that ran monthly auctions drawing buyers and sellers from across the county and beyond. Elira had been there twice as a child, once with her grandmother for dry goods, and once with Walt to deliver a repaired saddle to a customer who'd refused to come fetch it himself. She rode in on the roan again, alone this time, arriving an hour before the auction start. Kate had instructed her to come in separately, to find a position near the holding pens on the west side of the yard where the smaller lots were penned before sale, and to watch for animals with freshly worked brands. Not healed brands, not old altered brands, but recent ones, still dark and slightly proud from the iron. She knew what altered brands looked like. Walt had shown her once, years ago, on a piece of scrap leather, demonstrated how you could add lines to an existing mark, how you transformed one shape into another. The same way she could read mud and blade angles, she could read the grammar of a brand. She tied the roan at the far hitching line, paid her entry fee, and walked into the stockyard with her hands in her coat pockets and her expression set to the mild, slightly unfocused look she'd perfected over years of being looked through. Nobody looked at her twice. The yard was busy. Maybe 200 people. The smell of cattle and sawdust and smoke from the auction house fire mixing in the cold air. She moved through the crowd without hurrying, working her way toward the west pens, nodding when she caught someone's eye and otherwise contributing nothing to anyone's attention. The west pens held 8 lots. She walked the fence line slowly, the way a casual buyer does, looking at the animals with the appearance of someone evaluating what she might want to bid on. The third pen stopped her. 11 head, mixed breed, the kind of unspecialized stock that came from working ranches rather than breeding operations. She leaned on the fence and looked at them, and after a moment her eyes found what she was looking for. 4 animals in the back corner. The brands on their left flanks were dark and slightly swollen, the skin still reacting to the recent ironwork. She studied the marks as best she could from the fence. Under the altered brand, a simple cross design she didn't recognize, she could make out, in the slight irregularity of the new lines, the ghost of a different mark. The 3-notch mark. 3 horizontal cuts in a vertical bar. Her heart was moving faster than she wanted it to be. She kept her face on the cattle. She stayed at the fence for another 2 minutes, moving her gaze across all the animals so that anyone watching would see a woman evaluating a lot, not a woman focused on 4 specific brands. Then she pushed off the fence and walked unhurriedly toward the auction house to find Cade. She found him before she reached the door. He was near the east side of the building, talking to a man she didn't recognize, tall, lean, with a lawyer's bearing and a lawyer's coat. Ben. She stayed back until the conversation finished, and then Cade saw her and came over without making it obvious, angling toward her the way you'd angle toward something in your path, rather than something you were seeking out. West Penn, 3rd lot, she said quietly, without looking at him. 11 head, 4 in the back with worked brands. Recent, the skin is still reacting. She paused. I can see the 3-notch mark underneath. They changed it to a cross design. Cade said nothing for a moment. She could feel the controlled anger in him, the way you can feel heat from something not quite burning. Fen needs to see them before the lot comes up for sale, he said. He brought a brand recorder, he can document the alteration officially. Once it's documented, it's evidence. How long until the west lots come up? 40 minutes, maybe. They're running the north pens first. Then we need to move. They separated again. She went back to the west pen and positioned herself at the fence corner where the view was best and she was least obtrusive, behind a heavy-set man in a brown coat who was genuinely evaluating a lot 2 pens over and provided good visual cover. Cade came by 15 minutes later with Fen, who carried a leather satchel and moved with the purposeful quietness of a man who had done field work before. Fen spent 8 minutes at the fence. He made notes and small diagrams in a book from his satchel, documenting each of the 4 animals, the brand locations, the visible characteristics of the alterations. He didn't rush. He was thorough. When he was done, he closed the satchel and walked away without expression. That was when Garrett Cole appeared. He came from the direction of the sale office, a man with business inside, a man with a lot registered and a transaction pending. He was wearing his good coat, the one with the brass buttons she'd seen once at the shop, and he was moving with the confident, unhurried stride of a man who thought everything was proceeding correctly. He hadn't seen her. She was behind the brown-coated man, slightly angled away from the main path, and she was being very still. But he was going to reach the West Pens. He was going to see the lot. He was going to see Fenn walking away with a documentation satchel, and he was going to understand what that meant, and then whatever window they had would close. She made a decision. She stepped away from the fence and walked toward Cole at a normal pace, not fast, not hesitant, the way you walk toward someone you'd just noticed and wanted to exchange a brief word with. "Mr. Cole?" she said. He stopped. Surprise moved across his face, quickly managed, but there. "Miss Boone." "I didn't know you came to the Garrison auction." She said it with the mild curiosity of someone making conversation. "I'm here picking up a piece of tack for a customer. Do you buy here often?" He looked at her with the smile and the assessment behind it. "Sometimes. Business brings me through." His eyes moved past her shoulder toward the West Pens, then back. "I didn't know you rode all this way. 14 miles isn't far on a clear day." She kept her eyes on his face, kept her voice conversational and light. She needed 2 more minutes. She needed him looking at her instead of the pen. Fenn already at the sale office, Cade already at the recorder's desk filing the documentation request. 2 minutes. "I've been meaning to ask you, but you mentioned last week that you had a contact for a particular type of sole leather I've been having trouble sourcing. Did you follow up on that?" It was a question she'd asked him in September, an actual conversation she was now repurposing. The details were real enough to hold up, and Cole had enough transactions moving through his head that he wouldn't immediately identify the precise date of the original conversation. "I did look into it," he said, visibly relaxing a fraction. Business was safer ground than whatever he'd been worried about a moment ago. "The supplier in Millhaven actually— Wait, you said you'd switched to Millhaven. For harness leather, yes, but not for sole weight." She frowned slightly, the expression of a person realizing she'd created a minor confusion. "I'm sorry, I thought I'd explain that. My mistake." He looked at her. The smile was back, more fully. "No harm done. I'll write to my contact this week." "I'd appreciate it." She paused, tilted her head slightly. "You said you had a lot in this auction. Just a few head I'm moving for a friend. Small business." He said it with the easiness of a practiced liar, the kind of ease that came from believing the audience was manageable. "Nothing interesting." "I see." She nodded. "Well, good luck with it. I should find my tack order before the afternoon lots start." She stopped. Because Cade was walking across the open yard from the direction of the sale office, and he was not alone. Beside him was Fenn, and behind Fenn were 2 men she didn't recognize but whose bearing was not that of buyers or sellers. One of them had a badge on his coat that caught the thin winter light. Cole saw them a half-second after she did. She watched the transformation on his face. The smile pulling back, the calculation flooding in, the precise moment when a man understands that something he thought was under control is not. It was a terrible thing to watch, and she watched it anyway. "Cole," Cade said. His voice was level and carried across the yard without being raised. Other people were looking now. "I'd like you to meet Deputy Carver from the county marshal's office. He's here about some cattle." Cole stood very still. "The documentation is filed," Cade continued. 4 animals in your lot, West Pen 3, bearing altered 3-notch brands, witnessed and recorded by my attorney and a county deputy." He stopped a few feet away. "You want to tell me about Garrett, or do you want to start with Ellis Price and work backward?" The color had left Cole's face. The smile was completely gone, and without it his face looked older and smaller. A man who'd been hiding behind a performance for so long that the absence of it left almost nothing. "You've got nothing on Ellis," Cole said. His voice was controlled, but the control was the fragile kind. "You've got nothing that goes anywhere beyond—" "The brand recorder has 3 years of your lot filings," Fenn said pleasantly. "We'll be comparing the brand marks on everything you've moved through this yard in that period against 3-notch records, and against 3 other ranches that have reported losses in the county. That will take some time, but not as much time as you might hope." Cole looked at the deputy. He looked at Cade. He looked, briefly, at Elira. And in that look she saw recognition, understanding of exactly how long she'd been standing at the fence and why. "The girl," he said, with a flatness that was more frightening than anger would have been. "The boot mender," Cade said. "Yes." Cole's eyes stayed on her for a moment longer than was comfortable. She held his gaze. Her hands were in her coat pockets and they were not shaking, which she noted with a distant sort of appreciation for herself. Then Deputy Carver said something quiet to Cole, and Cole looked away, and the moment was over. The actual mechanics of what followed, the paperwork, the lot being held, the other deputy arriving from the east entrance where he'd apparently been positioned since morning, took the better part of 2 hours. Elira spent most of it waiting near the hitching line, out of the way, cold enough that she was going through her scarf's usefulness as insulation. Fen came by once to ask her to confirm the dates of Cole's shop visits, which she did precisely, and he wrote down without comment. Cade found her at the hitching line when it was mostly done. He looked drained in the way that action and its aftermath drains people. The tension had been released but hadn't left any warmth behind, just a kind of hollow tired. "Price is the problem," he said. "Cole will talk. Ben thinks he'll try to negotiate, give up names. But Price has money and connections and a land board position, and those things make men harder to move." "Fen will manage it," she said. "Probably." He looked out at the stockyard, the thinning crowd, the late afternoon light that was already going pale and low. 3 years of filings, 22 of my cattle, at minimum, and however many from the other 3 ranches. He stopped. "This has been running since before John Lacey left for California." "Do you think Lacey knew?" "No. I think they waited for the property to empty and then they used it." A pause. "There are men in Red Hollow who've been watching my north fence line for 3 years, waiting to see if I'd extend it. Paying Cole to keep the route clear. Paying Pete Marsh's brother to feed information about my plans." She looked at him sharply. "Pete's brother. Not Pete. The brother. Ray Marsh. Works at the hardware store." His jaw was tight. "Pete didn't know. I believe Pete didn't know." She thought about Denny helping move her grandfather, the matter-of-fact steadiness of him. Denny didn't know either. "No." He exhaled. "That's something, at least." The sky was going the particular dark orange of a cold sunset, the clouds catching the last light and turning it into something almost warm before the night took it. They stood at the hitching line and watched it without saying anything for a moment. "You kept Cole talking for 2 minutes, Cade said. "At the pen. I needed him not to look at the fence. You were standing between him and the evidence while Fen documented it." "I was having a business conversation," she said. He looked at her with that direct, still attention. "You knew what you were doing." "I knew what needed doing. It's not the same thing." "It is, actually." She untied the roan and smoothed her hand along the mare's neck, more for something to do with her hands than because the horse needed settling. The roan was patient and calm, unbothered by the yard noise. "My grandfather's going to be impossible about coming home," she said. "Ruth Hennessy's stew. I heard it's good. He told me it was better than mine. He said it directly while I was in the room." Something moved in Cade's expression. Not quite a smile, but the space where a smile might eventually live. It changed his face in a way she hadn't seen before, and she looked at it for a moment longer than she probably should have. "Come on," he said. "It's a long ride back in the dark." They rode east to west under the fading sky, and the cold was hard and clean, and Red Hollow sat in the dark ahead of them like something that didn't know yet what was coming for it. Red Hollow found out on a Friday. It didn't find out all at once. News in a town that size never arrived cleanly, in a single moment. It came in pieces, the way a storm comes. First the change in the air, then the clouds, then the rain. And by the time you understood it was a real storm, you'd already been standing in it for a while. The first piece arrived Thursday evening, when Deputy Carver rode in from Garrison and had a 2-hour conversation with Sheriff Burke behind a closed office door. The second piece arrived Friday morning, when Burke, looking like a man who'd been told he had work to do and was unhappy about it, rode out to Ellis Price's property on the east side of town with Carver and 2 men from the county marshal's office. The third piece arrived when Martha Price, who had seen the marshal's men ride past the mercantile window, closed her shop for the first time on a weekday in 6 years and went home and didn't come back out. By noon on Friday, Red Hollow knew that something had broken open. By 3 o'clock, it knew approximately what. By evening, it knew the names. Garrett Cole, Ellis Price, Ray Marsh from the hardware store, who had been arrested at his workplace and walked out past 6 customers in front of a silence that carried all the way down the block. 2 men from outside the county, hired hands who'd done the physical work of the cattle runs and the brand alterations, both currently in custody in Garrison. And the name that sat at the center of the operation, the buyer who'd been receiving altered cattle and reselling them clean across the state line. A man named Douglas Vane, who ran a legitimate-looking livestock brokerage out of Harmon City and who had apparently been building this particular supply chain for the better part of 4 years. Fenn had found Vane's name in Cole's financial records, which Cole had surrendered with the resigned thoroughness of a man who'd calculated that partial cooperation was better than none. The town was quiet in the specific way that towns go quiet when they're processing something that contradicts what they thought they knew about themselves. Not silent, there was plenty of talk, but the talk had a different quality than usual, less certainty in it. More of the uncomfortable shuffling of people rearranging what they'd believed to be true. Ellis Price had been on the land board for 9 years. He had been at the front of the church on every occasion that called for public presence. He had been, in the town's collective estimation, a solid man, the kind of man whose solidity you didn't question because it was convenient not to. People were questioning it now, loudly, and with the particular energy of people who felt, on some level, that they'd been made to look foolish, which is a feeling that converts quickly to anger. Alira opened the shop at the regular time Friday morning and said nothing about any of it to any of her customers. She did the work. She was stitching a pair of children's boots that had come apart at the toe, a small repair, 40 minutes of careful work, when Dorothea Hale walked in at 10:30. Alira looked up. Dorothea was not wearing her good coat. She had on a practical wool coat, dark brown, the kind of coat a woman wore when she was doing real errands and not performing anything. She was also not wearing her usual composure with the same ease. She looked, Alira thought, like a woman who had slept badly and knew it showed and had decided to come anyway. "Miss Boone," she said. "Mrs. Hale." A silence that was longer than the usual kind. "I heard about Garrison," Dorothea said. "About the auction. What you did." Alira waited. "I owe you an apology," Dorothea said. It came out cleanly, without excessive ceremony, which Alira respected more than she would have respected something elaborate. Dorothea Hale was a woman who did nothing without calculation, and the calculation here had apparently produced honesty, which was the most useful form the apology could have taken. "You don't owe me anything," Alira said. "I came into this shop and I was condescending to you," Dorothea said, with the level look of a woman holding herself to account. "I was unkind, and I dressed it up as concern, which is the worst kind of unkindness. I'd like to apologize for it." Alira put down the children's boot. She looked at Dorothea Hale, this woman who had represented, in Alira's daily life, a particular variety of dismissal, the kind that came wrapped in silk and smelled like good perfume. And she thought about what her grandfather would say, and she thought about what she actually felt, which was tired, mostly, and ready to be done carrying things that were other people's to carry. "Accepted," she said. Dorothea nodded. She looked briefly around the shop, not with the assessing gaze from before, but something quieter. "Your grandfather is at Ruth Hennessy's. He'll be home next week, I think. Give him my regards." A pause. "Walt Greer was a good man. He fixed the only pair of boots I ever truly loved, 3 times over, and never once made me feel foolish for keeping them past their useful life." She picked up her gloves from the counter where she'd set them. "You do the same quality of work. I should have said so before." She left. Alira sat for a moment after the door closed. Then she picked up the children's boots and went back to the toe stitching because it still needed doing. The week that followed was not simple. Ellis Price's arrest became complicated when his attorney argued jurisdiction, which delayed the formal charges in a way that made half the town anxious and the other half furious. Cole's cooperation with Fenn and the county marshal moved faster. Cole was a practical man who understood which way the current was running and was adjusting his position accordingly. His testimony documented 3 years of the operation's mechanics in meticulous detail, which was either reassuring or alarming depending on how you felt about a man who could describe his own crimes that precisely. Ray Marsh was released on bond and came into the hardware store on Tuesday morning like he was going to open up, and Tom Grady, who owned the feed store next door, walked over and told him quietly that it might be better if he didn't, and Ray Marsh looked at Tom Grady and looked at the street and went back to wherever he'd come from. Pete Marsh didn't come into town for 3 days after his brother's arrest, and when he finally did, Cade was with him. walking beside him down the main street with the steady, unself-conscious presence of a man who had decided where he stood. That was the thing people talked about most afterward. Not the arrests, not the legal proceedings, not even the money, though the money was considerable. The losses across 4 ranches adding up to a sum that made people wince when they heard it. What people talked about was Cade Mercer walking into town beside Pete Marsh 3 days after Pete's brother was arrested for helping steal from 3 Notch. The deliberateness of it. The statement it made without words. Cade didn't explain himself. He never did. But Red Hollow understood the gesture, and it sat with the town in a way that the legal proceedings didn't quite manage. Fenn returned to Buckton with documentation that he said would take several months to fully process through the county system, which was the legal system being exactly itself. Douglas Vane in Harmon City was a larger problem than a local deputy could handle, which brought in men from the state marshal's office who arrived in Garrison on a Wednesday and made the whole operation feel suddenly real in a way that Cole's arrest and Price's complicated jurisdiction arguments hadn't quite achieved. Alira brought her grandfather home on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks to the day after she'd moved him out. Denny came again with the wagon. Walt was quieter than usual on the ride back. He sat with his hands folded and his eyes on the buildings as they passed through town, looking at Red Hollow with the expression of a man who'd been away longer than 2 weeks, who'd been doing his own accounting of things from the ground floor room at Ruth Hennessy's, reading the news in the paper and thinking about ladders and bad men in his granddaughter's face. "The Cole man," he said, when they were almost at the shop. "He's in custody in Garrison," she said. Walt nodded, looked at the shop as Denny pulled the wagon to a stop. The sign, the cracked window with its rawhide patch, the faded letters of his name still on the board above the door. "You fixed it," he said. "The sign needs repainting," she said. "The window needs—" "I'm not talking about the sign." She helped him down from the wagon, or tried to. He waved off most of the help, but accepted her arm for the last part, the step from the wagon bed to the ground, which was the one that got his hip. They stood on the boardwalk in the thin November sun, and Walt looked at his shop with something on his face that she didn't have a clean name for. Pride and grief and satisfaction mixed together in the way that old men's feelings sometimes mixed, too close to separate. "2 years ago," she said. "The custom heel man. Did you know then, or just feel it?" "Just felt it," he said. "The way you feel weather before it arrives." He started slowly toward the door. "I should have told someone, should have said something to somebody." "You couldn't have known how far it went." "No, but I knew something was wrong, and I kept it to myself because I didn't want the trouble." He stopped at the door. "That's a thing to reckon with when you're old. The trouble you didn't want." She opened the door for him. The bell gave its small, tired jingle. "You told me once," she said, "that staying quiet isn't neutral." He looked at her. "You told me that in October," she said, "when I was trying to decide whether to say anything to Cade about the boots." Walt stood in the doorway of his shop, looking at the workbench and the tools on their pegs and the fire she'd built up before they left, already taking the chill off the room. His expression moved through several things she let him move through. "I said that, did I?" he said finally. "You said it like you'd always known it, like it was simple." "It is simple," he said. "Simple isn't the same as easy." He moved inside. "Put the kettle on, girl. Ruth Hennessy's coffee was adequate, and I want mine." She put the kettle on. Cade came to the shop the following Saturday. Not in the evening, not through the back door, not with his hat pulled low and his horse at the side alley. He came in the afternoon at a time when the main street had people on it, and he tied his horse at the front hitching post and came through the front door the way any customer would. The bell jingled. Alira looked up from the work. A set of dress boots that needed new heels, belonging to a man who was getting married in December and had left it to the last possible moment, which was a thing people always did. Cade looked different than he usually did when he came in. Not dressed up, he was in his regular working clothes, coat and hat, boots that she recognized as a pair she'd seen on his feet before. But there was something in his bearing that she noticed without being able to immediately name. He was not carrying the weight he'd been carrying for the past 2 months. Not gone exactly. Men like Cade didn't put things down so cleanly. But the specific tension of someone fighting something invisible had eased, and without it, he looked younger. Not soft, just less braced. "The price thing resolved," he said. I heard. Martha told me. Martha Price had come in 3 days ago for a heel repair, which was the first time she'd been in the shop, and had talked the whole time with the driven energy of a woman who needed to put words between herself and what had happened to her family's name. Ellis Price had taken a plea to avoid trial, which Fenn had described to Cade as the best available outcome, and which the town had received with the mixed feelings that real outcomes, as opposed to imagined ones, always produced. Vane's looking at federal charges, Cade said. The state marshal's office has enough. It'll take a while, but it'll stick. And your cattle. Some of them recovered from other auction records, enough to document the losses for the insurance claim. He paused. Probably 18 cents on the dollar in the end, but that's 18 cents more than nothing. She looked at the dress boots in her hands. Is that enough? It's what there is, he said. It wasn't resignation exactly, more the pragmatic accounting of a man who'd long since learned the difference between what should be and what was, and had stopped breaking himself on the gap. 3 notches sound, that's what matters. She nodded. He reached into his coat. He set a pair of boots on her counter. She looked at them. They were the boots. His boots? The ones she'd repaired in October, the torn sole and the corrected heel and the re-welted toe stitching. She recognized her own work in them, the specific tension of the thread, the particular approach to the heel buildup that she'd learned from Walt and adjusted slightly over the years. They need a polish, he said. She looked up at him. That's all, he said. Just a polish. She took the boots. She got her tin of wax and her cloth, and she began working the leather in small circles, the way Walt had showed her. Not rushing it, working the wax in before buffing, letting the leather take what it needed. Cade sat on the bench. Pete is staying on, he said after a while. He asked if I wanted him to go, given Ray. I told him no. Good. He cried a little when I told him. He thinks I didn't see, but I saw. A pause. Good man, Pete. Yes. The fire popped. Outside, 2 women passed on the boardwalk, their conversation audible and then fading. Elira worked the wax into the left boot, following the grain of the leather. I'd like to have dinner with you, Cade said. She stopped. Not a long pause. Just a breath's worth, just long enough to register it. At the hotel dining room, he said, Friday evening, if you're willing. Another pause, and in it she heard something she hadn't expected. A man who was not certain of the outcome, not performing uncertainty, actually in it. I'm not good at this. The asking, I haven't done it in a long time, and I was not particularly skilled at it before. She looked at the boot in her hands. You turned down 7 widows, she said. I didn't turn them down because they weren't worth knowing, he said. I turned them down because they were looking at the ranch and what came with it. The cattle count, the north fence line. He was quiet for a moment. You looked at my boots. She absorbed that. I'm 22, she said. I live in 2 rooms behind a boot shop. I have $34 in savings, a grandfather who argues with me about soup temperature, and I have never once in my life been described as a catch by anyone in this town. I know that. I'm not fishing for a denial, she said. I'm telling you what's true so that you know I'm not confused about the situation. I know what's true, he said. I've been watching this town dismiss you for 2 months while you held the whole thing together, and that's a thing a man doesn't forget once he sees it. He said it plainly, no decoration on it. I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I'm asking you to dinner. She put the boot down. She looked at him. He was watching her with the same attention he watched everything that mattered. Steady, direct, not hiding behind anything. She picked the boot back up and kept polishing. Friday, she said. I close the shop at 6. Something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. 6 o'clock. She finished the left boot and moved to the right. They sat in the quiet of the shop together, and it was not an uncomfortable quiet. It was the kind of quiet that 2 people settle into when they've been through something together and don't need to perform any feelings about it. After a while, Walt shuffled out of the back room in his slippers, which he wasn't supposed to be wearing because the floor was cold, and he looked at Cade on the bench, and he looked at Elira with the boots, and he made a sound that was mostly non-committal. Mercer, he said. Mr. Greer, Cade said. Hip's better, Walt said, to no one specifically. He moved to his high stool at the end of the bench and lowered himself onto it with careful effort, and he picked up a piece of harness leather that had been sitting there since October and turned it in his hands the way he did when his hands needed to be doing something. "How's your north fence holding?" he said. "Better than it was," Cade said. "The splice repair. I used your granddaughter's approach. Closer spacing than the original." Walt turned the leather over. "She learned that from me." "I know." Walt looked up at him then, with the clear, direct gaze of a man who had sized up a great many people in his life and retained opinions about most of them. Cade looked back without flinching, which was the only right answer. Walt looked at Alira. She met his eyes briefly and went back to the boots. Walt made his non-committal sound again and began working the leather, and the shop held the three of them in its small warmth. The fire, the smell of wax and oil, the light going low and golden in the November window. The following Friday, Cade Mercer walked into the hotel dining room at 6:15 with Alira Boone, and the dining room had 11 people in it, and every one of them saw. He did not hold her arm like she needed steadying. She did not hang back or make herself smaller. They sat at a table by the window, and they had dinner, and they talked, mostly about the ranch and the shop and Walt's recovery, and a book Alira had been reading that Cade hadn't, and he asked about it with a genuine curiosity that she found unexpectedly the most comfortable thing about the evening. At one point, she knocked her water glass with her elbow and caught it, barely, with about a third of it already on the tablecloth. And she said a word under her breath that made Cade's mouth pull to one side, and she felt the awkwardness of the moment and then felt it pass, and the passing of it felt like something important. The specific relief of being with someone in front of whom you didn't have to recover smoothly. News of the dinner reached Dorothea Hale's circle by the following morning. The circle's response was not uniform. Helen DuPont said she thought it was surprising. Martha Price, who had larger things on her mind, said nothing at all. Sylvia Crane said she didn't understand it. Agnes Whitmore, who was the oldest woman in the circle and rarely spoke but carried weight when she did, said that she thought Cade Mercer had finally found someone who looked at the right things. Nobody asked Alira about it directly, because Red Hollow had just watched her help dismantle the careers of several respected men, and the town was renegotiating, quietly and imperfectly, what it thought it knew about who mattered and why. The renegotiation was incomplete, and probably always would be. Towns don't transform, people don't transform, not all the way. There would still be women who walked past the shop and looked through the window and saw the plain, large girl at the workbench and drew their conclusions. There would still be men who heard the name Alira Boone and thought bootmender, Walt's girl, nothing remarkable. But there would also be the other thing, the memory that Red Hollow carried in itself, the true story that the town had witnessed and couldn't unwitness, that it had been the girl nobody expected who read the evidence in a pair of torn boots, who rode out in the cold to a ridge above a stolen cattle pen, who stood between a guilty man and the documentation of his crimes, and kept him talking for 2 minutes while the law caught up to him. The town would hold both things. That was the nature of towns and of people, the capacity to hold two contradictory truths at once and function anyway. Alira knew that. She'd always known that. She'd spent most of her life being the thing a town held in one hand while it held its admiration in the other. What was different now was not the town. What was different was that she'd stopped waiting for the town's version of her to catch up to her own. Walt mended the harness leather in November and was back to half days in the shop by December, which the doctor called remarkable for a man his age with his injuries, and Walt called inevitable because the shop didn't run itself and his granddaughter had enough to manage already. He moved more carefully now, and he rested more, and sometimes in the afternoon the pain got into his face in a way he couldn't fully hide. But his hands were steady on the tools, and his eye for a bad repair was as sharp as it had ever been. And when Alira brought home a piece of work she wasn't sure about, he looked at it and told her exactly where she'd gone wrong without any cushioning around it, which was the most useful form of love she'd ever received from anyone. In December, Cade extended his north fence line. It was a straightforward piece of work: fence posts, wire, the labor of 2 cold weeks with Pete and Denny, and a hired man for the heavy sections. The extension closed off the access trail through the breaks, formalized the 3-notch boundary the way he'd been planning since before any of this started. It was a ranching decision, a practical thing, the kind of thing that happened on working land all the time. But Red Hollow understood what it meant, and the understanding was quiet and final, like a door closing on something that had been left open too long. On a Saturday in late December, Cade came into the shop near closing time. Alira was finishing the last job of the day. A mend on a child's boot again. Different child, same problem. Children were consistently hard on their toe stitching. He sat on his bench. He watched her work. I want to say something, he said after a bit. She kept her hands moving. All right. When I brought those boots in October, I wasn't looking for anything. I want you to know that. It wasn't a strategy or a plan. I needed boots fixed, and you were the one who fixed boots. I know that, she said. I'm saying it because I want you to know that what happened after wasn't something I engineered. I don't want you to think, Cade. She looked up at him. I know. I was there. He looked at her. I wasn't looking for anything either, she said. I was looking at your boots. That's all I was doing. She held his gaze. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes looking at the right things at the right time is the whole of it. He was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather said something like that to me on Tuesday, he said. He says it to everyone. He's been saying it for 40 years. She went back to the stitching. Doesn't make it wrong. Outside, December held Red Hollow in its cold hands, and the light was going early the way it did at this time of year. The sky turning colors that the summer sky never managed, deep and clear and absolutely honest about the dark coming in. Inside the shop, the fire was warm and the tools were on their pegs, and the sign above the door still read Greer's Boot and Leather Repair. E. Boone, the letter still slightly uneven, still carefully done. Still standing. Some things hold not because they're perfect, but because the person behind them refused to stop. That's a quieter kind of strength than the kind that announces itself. It doesn't get celebrated until something breaks open and the light gets in, and people who never looked before suddenly look. Alira Boone had been holding for a long time before anyone thought to look. The boots sat on the shelf behind her workbench. Cade's boots. The ones she'd repaired in October, cleaned and polished and resoled and whole again. She'd put them there after he picked them up, kept the image of them as a kind of marker, a reminder of the night a stranger had walked in and set something in motion that neither of them had asked for. She didn't think of them as romantic. She thought of them as evidence, the same way she'd thought of the brake's mud and the blade angle. Evidence that sometimes a small thing, read correctly, opens into something much larger than itself. Her grandfather was in the back room, arguing with the soup. The fire held. The work continued.